I can still feel his cold skin against my arms, the way his wet hair stuck to my fingers like seaweed from the Guayas River. 3 minutes, that's all it took for my entire world to change forever. 3 minutes between watching him disappear under the murky water and hearing him whisper that single word that would haunt me for months. Madre, mother. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a fat, poor girl from Villa Esperanza became someone's salvation, and how in saving him, I finally learned to save myself. My name is Esperanza Milagros Gutierrez, and if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been the one they laugh at, if you've ever wondered if your life could possibly matter to anyone, then maybe my story will mean something to you too. Because 3 months ago, I was just another overweight 17-year-old girl trying to disappear into the wooden walls of our stilted house in the poorest neighborhood of Guayaquil, Ecuador. Today, I'm telling you about the day I found my courage in the depths of a contaminated river, holding a dying boy who would change everything. It was a Tuesday in March, when the humidity hung over Villa Esperanza like a wet blanket that never dries. You know that feeling when the air is so thick you can almost taste it. That's every day here, where the Guayas River meets the Pacific, where the smell of fish and motor oil and human desperation mingles into something you eventually stop noticing. Our neighborhood sits on stilts because the river floods every rainy season, and we've learned to live between water and sky, never quite touching solid ground. I was running, not the kind of running that means exercise, because let's be honest, when you're carrying as much weight as I was, running is more like fast walking with a lot of huffing and sweating. I was running from school, from the laughter that followed me down the dirt paths between our houses, from Azucena Marisol Vega and her pack of perfectly skinny friends who had just spent the entire lunch break making whale sounds every time I walked past their table. Esperanza, Esperanza the whale, come back, we want to see you swim. Azucena's voice carried on the wind, high-pitched and cruel. She was everything I wasn't, thin, pretty, with parents who owned one of the few concrete houses in our neighborhood. Her father sold cell phone accessories in the city center, which made her practically royalty in Villa Esperanza. I didn't stop running until I reached my secret place, a little clearing by the river where the mangrove trees created a natural shelter. The wooden dock here was rotting and abandoned, but it held my weight, and more importantly, nobody ever came here. The smell of low tide and decomposing vegetation was overwhelming, but it was mine. This was where I came to cry, to dream, to imagine a world where girls like me mattered. If you've ever been the target of bullies, if you know what it feels like to be reduced to just your appearance, leave a like on this video, because what I'm about to tell you proves that sometimes the people they pick on are the ones with the biggest hearts. I sat on the edge of that dock, my school uniform sticking to my sweaty skin, and I let myself cry. Not the pretty kind of crying you see in movies, but the ugly, snot-running, shoulder-shaking kind that comes from years of holding it in. The river water lapped against the wooden posts below me, making that gentle slapping sound that usually comforted me. But that day, something was different. That's when I first saw him. Across the narrow inlet, maybe 30 meters away, a boy was sitting on another broken dock. He couldn't have been much older than me, but he was thin, too thin, with dark hair that hung in his eyes and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He was staring at me, not in the mocking way I was used to, but with something that looked almost like recognition, like he knew exactly what it felt like to be where I was sitting. Our eyes met across the water, and for a moment, the world went completely silent. No car horns from the distant highway, no children playing in the contaminated shallows, no vendors calling out their wares. Just him and me and the space between us that felt both infinite and non-existent. Then he was gone. disappeared into the maze of mangrove roots and shanty houses like he had never been there at all. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and tried to convince myself I had imagined him. But something about those dark eyes stayed with me as I made my way home through the labyrinth of elevated walkways that connected our neighborhood. Villa Esperanza was built like a spiderweb, with narrow wooden bridges linking house to house, family to family. All of us suspended above the water that was both our lifeline and our curse. Esperanza, where have you been? My mother, Remedios Soledad Gutierrez, was hanging laundry on the line that stretched between our house and our neighbors. She worked as a washerwoman for the families in the better neighborhoods, and her hands were permanently wrinkled from the constant exposure to soap and water. Your father wants to talk to you. My stomach dropped. Conversations with my father, Celestino Amadeo Gutierrez, were never good news. He was a fisherman, like most men in our neighborhood, and the years of early mornings and uncertain catches had made him hard. Not cruel, exactly, but hard in the way that poverty makes people hard. Love was a luxury we couldn't afford to express. Openly, I found him on our small porch, mending a fishing net with the kind of patience that comes from doing the same task thousands of times. His weathered hands moved automatically through the repairs, while his dark eyes, so much like mine, studied my face. "Sit down, Mia," he said, without looking up from his work. The wood of our porch creaked under my weight, a sound that always made me feel self-conscious. "Your teacher came by today." My heart started racing. Had someone told him about the bullying? About how I had run away from school? "She says you're smart, Esperanza. Really smart. Says you could maybe get a scholarship to study nursing in the capital." He set down his net and looked at me directly. "But she also says you've been missing classes." I opened my mouth to explain, but he held up a calloused hand. "I don't want excuses. I want to know if you understand what this means. A scholarship means a way out of here. It means you don't have to worry about whether the fish are running or if the river floods next season. It means you could take care of your mother and your brothers properly someday." The weight of his words settled on my shoulders like a heavy shawl. My 4 younger brothers, Miguel, Carlos, Diego, and little Pablo, were playing in the courtyard below, their laughter floating up through the floorboards. They were thin, always thin, because there was never quite enough food. Pablo, the youngest, at 6, had started asking why he was always hungry, and none of us knew how to answer him. "I understand, Papa," I whispered. "Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're throwing away the only chance this family has ever had." His voice wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. It was disappointed, and disappointment from my father cut deeper than any insult Azucena could throw at me. That night, I lay in the bed I shared with my mother, while my father and brothers slept in the front room. The tin roof amplified every sound from the neighborhood: couples fighting, babies crying, the eternal hum of generators powering televisions and refrigerators that barely worked. But underneath it all was the constant whisper of the river, reminding us that we lived at its mercy. I thought about the boy I had seen by the water. Had I really seen him, or was my loneliness so complete that I was now imagining companions? Either way, I found myself hoping I would see him again. The next morning brought the usual chaos of getting 5 children ready for school with 1 working bathroom and limited hot water. My mother moved through our small house like a dancer, who had memorized every step, making breakfast with ingredients that seemed to multiply miraculously in her hands. A handful of rice became a meal for 7. A single egg became protein for the youngest 3. This was her daily magic, the kind that poor mothers perform without recognition or applause. "Esperanza, take this to Mrs. Rosa next door," She handed me a plate covered with a clean cloth. She helped me yesterday when Pablo was sick. This was how our neighborhood worked. We shared everything because we had nothing. When one family had extra rice, everyone ate rice. When someone's roof leaked, every man in the area would show up with whatever materials they could find. It wasn't charity. It was survival. Mrs. Rosa lived in the house closest to the river, and her front porch offered the best view of the water. As I handed her the plate, I scanned the area where I had seen the mystery boy the day before. The dock across the inlet was empty, but something caught my eye. A small pile of clothes, wet and abandoned on the muddy bank. Mrs. Rosa, I asked carefully, "Do you know if anyone new has moved to the neighborhood?" She was a woman in her 60s who had lived in Villa Esperanza longer than anyone could remember. If there was gossip to be known, she knew it. "Funny you should ask, Mia. I've been seeing a boy around here, maybe your age. Thin as a rail, looks like he hasn't eaten in weeks. I think he might be one of those Venezuelan kids." My heart skipped. Venezuela. That explained the clothes, the too-thin frame, the way he had looked at me with such recognition. He was a refugee, one of the millions who had fled their country's economic collapse. They arrived in Ecuador with nothing but hope and desperation, and even in our poor neighborhood, they were often treated as outsiders. "Have you seen where he's staying?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Rosa shook her head. "That's the thing, Mia. I don't think he's staying anywhere. I think he's living rough, maybe sleeping under the docks or in one of the abandoned houses." The thought of anyone sleeping outside in our neighborhood, with its flooding and mosquitoes and occasional violence, made my stomach clench. Even our crowded, leaking house was a palace compared to that. I spent the rest of the day at school trying to concentrate on my classes, but my mind kept wandering to the boy by the river, when Azucena and her friends started their usual routine of comments about my weight and my worn-out uniform. I barely heard them. For the first time in months, someone else's suffering seemed more immediate than my own. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear how this story changes everything. Because what happened next taught me that sometimes caring about someone else is the first step to caring about yourself. After school, instead of going straight home, I took a detour to the market. With the few coins I had been saving for a notebook, I bought a small portion of rice and beans, the kind of meal that would fill an empty stomach without costing much. The vendor, an old woman who had known my family for years, gave me an extra spoonful when I told her it was for someone who was hungry. I made my way back to the river, my heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and determination. What if he wasn't there? What if he was there but didn't want help? What if this was all a stupid idea from a girl who watched too many telenovelas and thought she could solve everyone's problems? But as I approached the clearing where I usually went to cry, I saw him. He was sitting in the same spot as the day before, but this time he was closer, maybe only 15 meters away. Close enough that I could see the dirt under his fingernails, and the way his ribs showed through his torn shirt. He looked up when he heard my footsteps on the wooden walkway, and our eyes met again. This time, neither of us looked away. "Hola," I called out, my voice barely carrying across the water. He didn't respond, but he didn't run either. He just watched me with those dark eyes that seemed too old for his face. I held up the container of food. "Are you hungry?" Something flickered across his expression, so quickly I almost missed it. Hope, maybe, or surprise that anyone had noticed he existed. He nodded, just barely. The problem was the water between us. The inlet was narrow but deep, and while I could swim a little, I wasn't confident enough to try it with food in my hands. But there was an old canoe tied up near my dock, abandoned and probably leaking, but still floating. "Wait here," I called to him. "I'm coming over." The canoe was exactly as rickety as it looked, and it sat so low in the water with my weight that I was sure it would sink before I made it across. But somehow, with a combination of determination and luck, I managed to paddle the 10 meters to his side of the inlet. Up close, he was even thinner than I had thought, and younger too, maybe 16, with the kind of face that would have been handsome if it hadn't been so gaunt. His clothes were clean but patched in multiple places, and his shoes were held together with what looked like fishing line. "I'm Esperanza," I said, climbing out of the canoe with as much dignity as I could manage. "Valentino," he replied, and his voice was soft, with an accent that confirmed Mrs. Rosa's guess about his nationality. "Valentino Aurelio Santos." I handed him the container of food, and for a moment our fingers brushed. His were cold, despite the heat, and rough with calluses that spoke of hard work. He opened the container and stared at the rice and beans like he couldn't believe they were real. Then he looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I recognized from my own mirror. Shame, the shame of needing help, of being seen at your lowest moment, of being reduced to accepting charity from a stranger. "Thank you," he whispered. And then he ate like he hadn't seen food in days, which I suspected was probably close to the truth. I sat down on the dock beside him, leaving enough space so he wouldn't feel crowded, but close enough that we could talk. The wood was warm from the sun, and the river smelled less overwhelming here, where the current was stronger. "How long have you been in Ecuador?" I asked. He paused in his eating, a spoonful of rice halfway to his mouth. 3 months, maybe 4. Time gets ... confused when you're traveling. Are you alone? The question hung in the air between us like smoke. He set down the spoon and stared out at the water for a long moment. "Now I am," he said finally. I wanted to ask what had happened to his family, but something in his voice told me that was a conversation for another day. Instead, I asked, "Where are you staying?" He gestured vaguely toward the mangrove trees. Around, there are places, which meant he was homeless, sleeping rough in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in Guayaquil. My heart clenched with a sympathy I had never felt for anyone but myself. "That's not safe," I said. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Safe is a luxury, Esperanza. Like choosing what to eat, or having clean clothes, or knowing you'll wake up in the same place you fell asleep. I gave up on safe a long time ago." Something about the way he said my name, with that soft Venezuelan accent, made my stomach flutter in a way that had nothing to do with hunger or fear. It was the first time in my life that a boy my age had spoken to me like I was a person rather than a target or an object of ridicule. "Why did you come here?" I asked. "To Ecuador, I mean." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Because staying meant dying. And even though leaving felt like dying too, at least there was a chance it wouldn't be forever." We sat in silence after that, watching the river carry debris toward the sea. Plastic bottles, pieces of wood, clumps of vegetation that had been torn loose from somewhere upstream. Everything in the river was going somewhere else, and I wondered if that made us all refugees in our own way. "I should go," I said finally. "My mother will be worried." He nodded and handed me back the empty container. "Thank you, Esperanza. Really ill. I'll try to come back tomorrow. If you're here, I'll be here," he said, and something in his voice made it sound like a promise. The paddle back to my side of the inlet felt shorter. Maybe because I had something to look forward to now. Someone who saw me as more than just the fat girl who got picked on at school. Someone who needed me, maybe as much as I needed to be needed. That night at dinner, my father asked me about school, and for the first time in months, I had something positive to report. I had participated in class discussions, turned in homework on time, even volunteered to help the teacher with a project. What I didn't tell him was that I had spent the entire day thinking about Valentino, and the empty look in his eyes when he talked about safety being a luxury. "Good," my father said, and there was approval in his voice that I hadn't heard in a long time. "Keep it up, Mia. Remember what I told you about that scholarship?" I nodded, but my mind was already elsewhere, planning what I could bring Valentino. The next day, without my family noticing the missing food, over the following weeks, I developed a routine. Every day after school, I would find some excuse to go to the market or visit Mrs. Rosa, and I would always end up at the river with whatever food I could manage to acquire. Sometimes it was leftovers from our own dinner, carefully saved and explained away as not hungry or ate too much at lunch. Sometimes it was fruit that was slightly overripe, sold cheap by vendors who knew it wouldn't last another day. Valentino was always there, waiting by the water like some kind of guardian spirit of the abandoned dock. We would sit together in the shade of the mangrove trees, and slowly, piece by piece, he began to tell me his story. He had lived in Caracas with his mother, a nurse who worked double shifts to keep them fed as Venezuela's economy collapsed around them. His father had left when Valentino was 12, unable to handle the stress of watching his family slowly starve despite his best efforts to find work. "My mother was everything," he told me one afternoon as we watched the tide come in. "She was small, maybe your height, but she was fierce. When the hospitals ran out of supplies, she would trade her own food for medicines to take care of her patients. When the government cut the power, she would work by candlelight. She never gave up on anything." His voice broke slightly on the last words, and I knew without asking that something terrible had happened to her. "She got sick," he continued, staring at his hands. "It started small, just tiredness. But then she couldn't keep food down, and she lost weight so fast it was like watching someone disappear a little bit every day. The hospitals had no medicine, no equipment, no hope to offer. She died in our apartment on a Tuesday morning while I was out trying to find work. I reached over and took his hand without thinking. His fingers were still cold, always cold, as if that Tuesday morning had frozen something inside him that would never thaw. "I'm sorry," I whispered, and the words felt completely inadequate. "I stayed with her body for 3 days," he said, and his voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear him over the sound of the water. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't afford a funeral, couldn't afford to bury her properly, and I couldn't bear the thought of leaving her alone. Tears were running down my face now, not for myself, but for him, for a grief so enormous it made my own problems seem small and petty. "What happened then?" I asked. "A neighbor finally convinced me that I had to leave. She said my mother wouldn't want me to die in that apartment too. So I kissed her goodbye and walked out with nothing but the clothes I was wearing and the few bolivars I had hidden under the mattress. I walked to the border with Colombia, then to the border with Ecuador. It took me 2 months to get here. And you've been alone this whole time." He nodded. "There are other Venezuelan kids on the streets, but most of them are in groups. And groups are ... complicated. They do things I'm not willing to do to survive. Steal from people who don't have much to begin with, sell drugs to kids, hurt people who are just trying to help. I decided I'd rather be hungry than become someone my mother wouldn't recognize. Comment below if you've ever met someone who restored your faith in humanity, because Valentino was about to become that person for me. As the days turned into weeks, our friendship deepened into something I had never experienced before. It wasn't romance, exactly, though there was definitely something electric about the way he looked at me when I laughed, or the way my heart sped up when our hands accidentally touched. It was more like recognition, like we were two people who had been walking through the world feeling invisible, and suddenly we could see each other with perfect clarity. He told me about his dreams of becoming a doctor, like his mother had wanted to be, before the economic crisis made higher education impossible for families like theirs. I told him about my secret desire to study nursing, to be the kind of person who could heal rather than just endure. We talked about books we had read, places we wanted to travel, futures that seemed impossible but felt less impossible when we imagined them together. "You're going to get that scholarship," he told me one evening as the sun set over the river, painting the water gold and orange. "You're smart, Esperanza. Smarter than you think you are." "I'm fat," I said automatically, because that was always my first response when anyone tried to compliment me. So he turned to look at me directly, his dark eyes serious. "What does that have to do with your brain? What does that have to do with your heart? You're the only person who has shown me kindness since I got to this country. You're the only person who sees me as a human being instead of a problem to be solved or ignored. If that's what fat looks like, then maybe the world needs more fat." I stared at him, shocked into silence. In 17 years of life, no one had ever suggested that my worth might exist independently of my appearance. Even my own family, who loved me, seemed to see my weight as a problem to be fixed, rather than a simple fact about my body. "You don't understand," I said finally. "People look at me and they see ... nothing. They see someone to laugh at or ignore or pity. They don't see someone who could be a nurse or a mother or anything important. Then they're idiots," he said with such conviction that I almost believed him. "Besides, who cares what they see? The only opinion that matters is your own." Easy. Words from someone who looked like he could be in a magazine, I thought. But even as I dismissed his advice, part of me held on to it like a life preserver. Our conversations weren't always serious. He had a sense of humor that had survived everything he had been through, and he could make me laugh in a way that felt like medicine. He would tell me stories about the characters he had met during his journey to Ecuador, imitating their voices and mannerisms until I was giggling so hard I'd forgot to be self-conscious about the way my stomach shook. He also listened to my stories. About school, about Azucena and her friends, about the daily humiliations that had become so routine I barely noticed them anymore. But when I told him about them, he noticed. His jaw would clench and his eyes would flash with anger, not at me but for me. "They're afraid," he said, one day after I had described a particularly cruel incident involving my lunch money and a drainage ditch. "Afraid of what?" "I'm not exactly threatening. Afraid of your kindness. Afraid of your intelligence. Afraid that if they really looked at you, they might have to admit that their definition of valuable is wrong." He picked up a small stone and skipped it across the water. Bullies always attack what they're afraid of becoming. It was such a different way of thinking about the situation that I couldn't quite wrap my mind around it. The idea that Azucena might be afraid of anything, let alone afraid of me, seemed absurd. But as the weeks passed, I started to notice things I had missed before. The way Azucena's perfect smile never quite reached her eyes. The way she seemed to need constant validation from her friends, as if her worth depended on their approval. The way she chose her targets carefully, always picking on people who were unlikely to fight back or get her in trouble. Maybe Valentina was right. Maybe cruelty was just fear wearing a disguise. Turn on notifications if stories about finding strength in unexpected places inspire you, because what happened next changed everything. It was a Friday in late April, and the rainy season was threatening to start early. The air was so thick with humidity that even breathing felt like work, and storm clouds were gathering over the Gulf of Guayaquil like an army preparing for battle. I had been having a particularly bad week at school. Azucena had somehow found out about my family's financial situation and had been making loud comments about charity cases and people who don't belong every time I walked past. Her cruelty had reached a new level of personal, and I was feeling more fragile than usual. "You know what your problem is," she had said that morning, loud enough for the whole classroom to hear. You think you're special because you get good grades, but grades don't matter if you're still going to end up cleaning houses like your mother. Some people are just born to be servants. The worst part wasn't the insult itself. The worst part was the grain of truth in it. Without that scholarship, without some kind of miracle, I probably would end up cleaning houses or washing laundry or selling food on the street. My intelligence might get me through high school, but it wouldn't necessarily get me out of Villa Esperanza. I had run from school earlier than usual, tears streaming down my face, desperate to get to the river where Valentino would be waiting. He had become my anchor, the one person who could make me feel like I mattered. But when I reached our usual meeting spot, he wasn't there. I waited for an hour, then 2. The storm clouds were getting darker, and the wind was picking up. But I couldn't bear the thought of going home to face my family's questions about why I was upset. So I sat on the dock and cried, letting the wind carry away my sobs so no one would hear them. That's when I saw him. Valentino was standing on the far bank of the inlet, maybe 50 meters away, but something was wrong. He was swaying on his feet like he was drunk or sick, and even from a distance I could see that his clothes were torn and dirty. Had he been in a fight? Was he hurt? Valentino, I called out, but the wind carried my voice away before it could reach him. He turned toward me, and even across the water I could see that his face was streaked with tears. He raised one hand in what might have been a wave or a goodbye, and then he started walking toward the water. At first I thought he was just going to sit by the edge, like he usually did, but he didn't stop. He walked straight into the river, the muddy water rising to his ankles, then his knees, then his waist. "Valentino, stop," I screamed, jumping to my feet. "What are you doing?" But he kept walking, deeper and deeper, until the current caught him and he disappeared beneath the surface. The next 3 minutes were the longest of my life. I didn't think. I didn't consider my weight, or my limited swimming ability, or the fact that the river was contaminated and dangerous. I didn't think about anything except the fact that the only person who had ever seen me as valuable was drowning, and I was the only one who could save him. I dove off the dock and into the murky water, my school uniform instantly soaked and heavy around my body. The current was stronger than I had expected, and colder, and the water tasted like oil and fish and things I didn't want to identify. But I forced myself to swim toward the spot where he had gone under, my heart pounding so hard. I could hear it over the sound of the river. I couldn't see him. The water was too murky, stirred up by the wind and the approaching storm. I dove under the surface, opening my eyes despite the sting of pollution, sweeping my arms in wide arcs and hoping to make contact with something. Anything. Nothing. I came up for air, gasping and panicking, and dove again. This time I went deeper, using my weight to my advantage, letting it pull me down toward the river bottom, where the current was weaker. My lungs were burning and my vision was starting to blur when my hand finally made contact with fabric. I grabbed hold of what felt like a shirt and pulled upward with every ounce of strength I had. Valentino's body was limp and waterlogged, heavier than I had expected, but somehow I managed to get him to the surface. His eyes were closed and his lips were blue, and for a terrible moment I thought I was too late. The swim back to shore was the hardest thing I had ever done. My own body was exhausted and weighed down by wet clothes, and I was essentially dragging dead weight through water that seemed determined to pull us both under. But somehow, maybe through pure stubborn will, or maybe through the kind of strength that comes from desperation, I managed to get us both to the muddy bank near my dock. I pulled him out of the water and onto dry land, his body unnaturally cold. And still, water poured from his mouth and nose, and he wasn't breathing. I had never performed CPR before, but I had seen it in movies and telenovelas. An instinct took over where knowledge failed. I tilted his head back, pinched his nose, and breathed into his lungs. Once, twice, 3 times. Then I placed my hands on his chest and pushed, trying to remember the rhythm I had seen on television. Push, 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 breathe. Push, 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 breathe. Nothing happened. I tried again, putting all my weight behind the compressions, ignoring the way his ribs felt fragile under my hands. Push, 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 breathe. Push, push, breathe. Still nothing. Tears were streaming down my face now, mixing with river water and fear. I couldn't lose him. Not when I had just found him. Not when he was the first person who had ever made me feel like I was enough, exactly as I was. Please, I whispered to God, or the universe, or anyone who might be listening. Please don't take him away from me. I'll do anything. I'll be better. I'll be worthy of that scholarship. I'll stop feeling sorry for myself. Just please let him live. I tried the CPR again, and this time, on the 3rd breath, he coughed, water erupted from his lungs in a violent stream, and his eyes fluttered open. For a moment he looked completely disoriented, like he couldn't remember where he was or how he had gotten there. Then his gaze focused on my face, and he whispered the word that would echo in my mind for months afterward. Madre, mother. In his delirium, he thought I was his mother. The woman who had raised him alone, who had died alone, who had loved him enough to make him want to follow her into whatever came after this life. I'm here, I whispered, brushing his wet hair away from his forehead. You're safe. I'm here. He closed his eyes again, but this time he was breathing, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of life. I held him against me there, on the muddy bank of the Guayas River, both of us soaked and shivering, and I felt something shift inside me. Something that had been broken was beginning to heal. Share this video if you believe that love can save us from ourselves, because that's exactly what happened next. I don't know how long we sat there before Mrs. Rosa found us. She had seen me jump into the river from her porch and had called for help, which in Villa Esperanza meant shouting until someone with a boat came running. By the time they reached us, Valentino was conscious but weak, and I was holding him like I might hold a child who had woken from a nightmare. Dios mío. What happened? Mrs. Rosa was wrapping us both in blankets that smelled like mothballs and safety. He was trying to hurt himself, I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. I had never spoken about suicide before, had never imagined that someone so young could carry that kind of pain. He walked into the river and didn't try to swim. The man who had brought the boat, Mr. Esteban from 3 houses down, helped us get Valentino back to shore. He was a gentle giant who had raised 6 children of his own, and he lifted Valentino like he weighed nothing. We need to get him to the clinic, he said. He needs proper medical attention. The clinic was really just a converted house where Hermano Esteban Morales, a priest who had trained as a paramedic before finding his calling, provided basic medical care to our neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing, which in Villa Esperanza was often the best you could hope for. As we made our way through the maze of elevated walkways, Valentino drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he would mumble words in Spanish that I couldn't quite catch, and sometimes he would grab my hand with a grip that spoke of desperation and gratitude in equal measure. The clinic smelled like disinfectant and hope, if hope has a smell. Hermano Esteban took one look at Valentino and immediately began checking his vital signs with the kind of competence that reminded you he had been saving lives long before he started saving souls. River water in the lungs, mild hypothermia, severe malnutrition, he murmured to himself as he worked. When did he last eat? Yesterday, I said. I brought him food yesterday. Hermano Esteban looked up at me with raised eyebrows. You've been feeding him? I nodded, suddenly worried that I had done something wrong. He didn't have anywhere to go. He's been living by the river. Alone, yes, he's from Venezuela. His mother died, and he traveled here by himself. The priest's expression softened. One of our lost boys. He returned to examining Valentino, but continued talking. We see more and more of them. Children who have lost everything, walking thousands of miles with nothing but hope and determination. Most of them don't make it this far. Is he going to be okay? Physically, yes. A few days of rest and proper food should help his body recover. But this was